Your sister Sarah is uncomfortable with all the attention you're getting. My father's words hit me like a slap across the face as I stood in the kitchen of my childhood home in Charlotte, North Carolina. I had stopped by after work to finalize the last-minute wedding details, never expecting this bombshell. "What are you saying, Dad?" I asked, though the sinking feeling in my stomach already knew where this conversation was heading. Donald Hamilton, my father, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding my eyes. "I've been thinking about the wedding, and I don't think I should walk you down the aisle. Sarah feels like you're getting too much attention, and it's making her uncomfortable. She's been really upset about the whole thing." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline that never came. 2 weeks before my wedding day, and my own father was backing out of one of the most important moments of my life because my younger sister was jealous. "Thanks for showing me who really matters to you," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. "My name is Charlotte Hamilton, and I'm 28 years old. I work as a marketing director for Sunnindale Financial here in Charlotte, and I've spent years planning what I thought would be the perfect wedding. But apparently perfect doesn't account for family dysfunction and lifelong favoritism. This wasn't the first time Donald had chosen Sarah's feelings over mine, but I never imagined he'd do it on my wedding day. The man who was supposed to love me unconditionally had just proven that his love came with conditions, and apparently those conditions included not making his precious younger daughter feel overshadowed. I felt something crack inside me, not just my heart, but my expectations, my hope that maybe this time would be different. The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock that had been in our family for generations. How fitting that the only constant, reliable presence in this house was made of wood and metal rather than flesh and blood. "Charlotte, you're being dramatic," Donald said, still not meeting my eyes. "Sarah is having a hard time right now, and as her father, I need to support her." And as my father, I asked, but he didn't answer. That's when I knew exactly what I had to do. The solution was so obvious, I couldn't believe I hadn't thought of it immediately. If Donald Hamilton didn't want to walk me down the aisle, there was someone who had been more of a father to me anyway. Someone who had never once chosen Sarah's feelings over mine. Someone who had earned that honor through decades of unwavering love and support. The revenge I was about to unleash would be poetic in its justice. Growing up, I had always been caught between two father figures. There was Donald, my biological father, who worked long hours at the textile factory and seemed perpetually tired, perpetually distant. Then there was Grandpa Theodore, my mother's father, who had moved in with us after my mother died when I was 8 years old. Theodore Hamilton had been the one to braid my hair for school when Donald was too busy. He attended every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every graduation ceremony. When I had nightmares, it was Theodore who sat beside my bed reading stories until I fell back asleep. When I needed help with homework, Theodore was there with infinite patience. When I got my first job, Theodore celebrated with homemade cake and genuine pride. Donald had always been present physically, but emotionally distant. He showed up to major events when reminded, but Theodore was the one who remembered the little things. He knew I hated mushrooms and loved strawberry ice cream. He knew I was afraid of thunderstorms and that I dreamed of traveling to Italy someday. He knew me in ways that Donald never seemed to notice. The favoritism towards Sarah had started early. She was 5 years younger than me, born when I was still grieving our mother's death. Donald seemed to pour all his parental energy into her, as if making up for something he felt he'd failed to give me. Sarah got the new clothes, while I wore hand-me-downs. She got to choose our family vacation destinations while my preferences were dismissed. She got his attention while I got his obligations. But Theodore never played favorites. He loved us both, but he also saw us both clearly. He celebrated my achievements without diminishing Sarah's, and he gently corrected Sarah's more selfish tendencies without making her feel unloved. He was the steady, nurturing presence that held our fractured family together. As I stood in that kitchen listening to Donald explain why his 23-year-old daughter's comfort mattered more than his 28-year-old daughter's wedding day, I realized something profound. Theodore had always been more of a father to me than Donald ever was. The man who had raised me, supported me, and loved me unconditionally was sitting in his room down the hall, probably reading one of his history books, completely unaware that he was about to become the star of my wedding day. I pulled out my phone and walked toward Theodore's room. Donald called after me, probably expecting me to beg him to reconsider, to promise that I'd talk to Sarah and somehow make this right. But I was done begging for scraps of affection from a man who had never learned how to be a real father. Theodore was going to walk me down the aisle, and Donald was about to learn what it felt like to be an afterthought at his own daughter's wedding. I knocked softly on Theodore's door, my heart pounding with a mixture of hurt and determination. At 82 years old, my grandfather had slowed down physically, but his mind was as sharp as ever, and his love for me had never wavered. "Come in, sweetheart," his warm voice called out. I found him sitting in his favorite armchair, a biography of Winston Churchill, open in his lap. His face lit up when he saw me, the same way it had every day for the past 20 years. This man had never once made me feel like a burden or an afterthought. "Grandpa, I need to ask you something important," I said, settling on the ottoman beside his chair. "Of course. Charlotte, what's on your mind?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "Would you walk me down the aisle at my wedding?" Theodore's eyebrows rose in surprise, and he set his book aside. "What about your father? I thought Donald was walking you down the aisle." "He was, but he's decided that Sarah's comfort is more important than my wedding day," I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. "Apparently, I'm getting too much attention, and it's making her uncomfortable, so he's backing out." Theodore's expression shifted from surprise to something much darker. In all my years, I had rarely seen my grandfather truly angry, but the flash in his eyes told me that Donald had finally crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "That boy," Theodore muttered, and I knew he wasn't talking about me. Even at 55, Donald would always be Theodore's disappointing son-in-law in moments like this. "Grandpa, you've been more of a father to me than he ever has," I continued. "You were there for every important moment in my life. You taught me to drive, helped me with college applications, celebrated every promotion at work. You know me better than anyone, and you've loved me without conditions or competitions. Will you do me the honor?" Theodore's eyes filled with tears, and he reached for my hands. "Charlotte, my dear girl, it would be the greatest honor of my life to walk you down that aisle. You are the light of my life, and I have watched you grow into the most remarkable woman. Your grandmother would have been so proud." I felt tears streaming down my face, but for the first time in hours, they were tears of joy rather than hurt. "Thank you, Grandpa. I love you so much." "I love you, too, sweetheart. More than you'll ever know." As I hugged Theodore, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Donald appeared in the doorway, his face a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. "What's going on here?" he asked. "Grandpa is walking me down the aisle," I said simply, not moving from Theodore's embrace. The look on Donald's face told me that my backup plan was already working perfectly. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of wedding preparations and family tension. Donald had tried multiple times to convince me to let him walk me down the aisle. But each conversation only reinforced my decision. He would start with guilt, move to anger, and then attempt bribery, but never once did he actually acknowledge what he had done wrong. Charlotte, you're being ridiculous, he said during one particularly heated discussion. I'm your father. It's my right to walk you down the aisle. Rights are earned, not given, I replied calmly. Grandpa earned that right every single day for 20 years. What Donald didn't understand was that this wasn't just about the wedding day. This was about a lifetime of being second best, of having my feelings dismissed in favor of Sarah's comfort, of being treated like an obligation rather than a beloved daughter. The wedding was simply the final straw that broke my willingness to accept his half-hearted love. Theodore, meanwhile, had thrown himself into wedding preparations with enthusiasm that warmed my heart. He insisted on buying a new suit, spent hours practicing his walk to make sure he could handle the aisle without his cane, and even asked to see the church beforehand so he could visualize the moment perfectly. I want everything to be perfect for you, my dear, he said as we stood in the sanctuary of St. Michael's Church, where I would be married in 10 days. It will be perfect because you'll be there, I assured him. The guest list had become another source of drama. Most of our extended family knew Theodore as my primary father figure, so they weren't surprised by the change. In fact, many of them seemed relieved that someone would finally stand up to Donald's favoritism. My Aunt Patricia, Theodore's daughter, and my mother's sister had been particularly supportive. It's about time someone put that man in his place, she said during a phone call. Theodore raised you after your mother died, not Donald. Theodore deserves this honor. But Sarah was furious. She had called me 3 times, each conversation more heated than the last. You're destroying our family, she accused during our final conversation before the wedding. Dad is heartbroken, and it's all your fault. Dad made his choice when he decided your feelings were more important than my wedding. I replied, I'm just living with the consequences of his decision. You're being selfish and vindictive. I'm being authentic for the first time in my life. I said, I'm done pretending that Dad's neglect is acceptable just to keep the peace. The truth was, I wasn't trying to punish Donald as much as I was trying to honor the man who had actually earned the title of father in my life. Theodore had been my rock, my supporter, my cheerleader, and my guide. He deserved to walk me down the aisle, not as a replacement for my father, but as recognition of who my real father had always been. 3 days before the wedding, Theodore and I met with Reverend Matthews, who would be officiating the ceremony. I had asked for a special addition to the traditional service. Reverend, when you introduce the person walking me down the aisle, I'd like you to say something specific, I explained. Of course. Charlotte, what would you like me to say? I'd like you to announce Theodore Hamilton, Charlotte's beloved grandfather and the father figure who raised her with unconditional love. Reverend Matthews smiled warmly. That's beautiful, Charlotte. I think that's a perfect tribute to your grandfather's role in your life. Theodore squeezed my hand, tears in his eyes. You don't need to do that for me, sweetheart. I'm not doing it for you, Grandpa, I said. I'm doing it because it's the truth. The morning of my wedding dawned clear and bright, a perfect October day in Charlotte. I woke up in my childhood bedroom, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and melancholy. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, and in many ways it would be, but the absence of my father's support cast a shadow over everything. Theodore knocked on my door at 8 a.m., carrying a cup of coffee made exactly how I liked it. Good morning, beautiful bride, he said, his eyes already bright with pride and joy. Good morning, Grandpa, I said, accepting the coffee gratefully. Are you ready for this? I've been ready for this day since you were 8 years old. he said simply. We spent the morning getting ready. Together, something that felt surprisingly natural. Theodore had always been comfortable with the emotional intimacy that Donald had never managed. He helped me with my necklace, told me stories about my mother's wedding day, and held my hand when I got nervous about walking down the aisle. Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become, he said as we looked at ourselves in the full-length mirror. And she would be proud that you chose love over obligation today. At noon, we arrived at the church. I could see Donald's car in the parking lot, and I felt a familiar knot in my stomach. He would be sitting in the congregation as a regular guest, watching his father-in-law fulfill the role he had abandoned. Part of me felt guilty for the humiliation he would experience, but a larger part of me felt vindicated. Actions had consequences, and he was about to experience his. In the bridal room, my maid of honor, Jessica, helped me with final touches to my dress and makeup. She had been my roommate in college and knew the full history of my relationship with Donald and Theodore. Are you having any second thoughts? She asked gently. None at all, I said firmly. Grandpa has earned this moment, and Dad chose to give it up. I'm at peace with my decision. At 2 p.m., the music began. Jessica and the other bridesmaids walked down the aisle, followed by my flower girl, Sarah's 6-year-old daughter, Sophia, who had thankfully been kept out of the adult drama. Then it was time. Theodore appeared at my side, looking distinguished and proud. In his new navy suit, he had traded his usual cane for a walking stick that had belonged to his own father, a family heirloom that made the moment even more meaningful. Ready, my dear? He asked, offering me his arm. Ready, Grandpa? I said, taking his arm and feeling a sense of rightness that I had never experienced with Donald. The church doors opened, and I saw the faces of everyone I loved turning toward us. My husband-to-be, James, stood at the altar, with tears in his eyes. The photographer captured every moment as Theodore and I began our walk down the aisle. But I also saw Donald sitting in the third row, his face a mask of regret and realization. Sarah sat beside him looking uncomfortable and angry. They had gotten exactly what they asked for, a wedding day where Sarah wouldn't have to watch her sister receive their father's attention, but they clearly hadn't anticipated how it would actually feel to watch Theodore take the place of honor that Donald had thrown away. As we walked, I heard whispers of approval from the guests, many of whom knew our family history and understood the significance of this moment. This was it. This was my revenge. Sweet and public and absolutely justified. As Theodore and I reached the front of the church, Reverend Matthew stepped forward with a warm smile. Dearly beloved, he began, we are gathered here today to witness the marriage of Charlotte Hamilton and James Rodriguez. Charlotte is being walked down the aisle by Theodore Hamilton, her beloved grandfather, and the father figure who raised her with unconditional love. The words rang out clearly through the sanctuary, and I saw several guests nodding in approval. Theodore squeezed my arm gently, his eyes shining with pride and emotion. Who gives this woman to be married to? This man, Reverend Matthews asked. Theodore straightened his shoulders, his voice strong and clear despite his 82 years. Her grandmother Margaret and I do with all our love and blessing. I glanced back toward the congregation and saw Donald's face had gone pale. The public announcement of Theodore's role, combined with the traditional giving away ceremony, had made it crystal clear to everyone in attendance who had actually earned the right to this honor. Several relatives were looking between Donald and Theodore with expressions that ranged from approval to barely concealed judgment. Sarah sat rigid in her seat, her face flushed with what looked like embarrassment rather than the satisfaction she had probably expected to feel. She had wanted less attention on me, but instead she had created a situation where everyone in the church was acutely aware of our family drama and Donald's failure as a father. After Theodore kissed my cheek and took his seat in the front row, the seat traditionally reserved for the father of the bride, the ceremony continued. James and I exchanged vows, rings, and our first kiss as husband and wife. But I kept glancing at Theodore, who was beaming with such joy that it made my heart full despite everything. The recessional music began, and as James and I walked back down the aisle, as newlyweds, I saw the full impact of my decision written on faces throughout the congregation. Aunt Patricia was crying happy tears and nodding approvingly at Theodore. My cousins were smiling and whispering positive comments. Even James's family, who didn't know our history, seemed charmed by the dignified older gentleman who had clearly played such an important role in my life. But Donald looked devastated, not angry, not frustrated, devastated. He was seeing, perhaps for the first time, what his years of emotional neglect and favoritism had cost him. He had lost the honor of walking his daughter down the aisle. But more than that, he had lost the respect of his extended family and the acknowledgement of his role in my life. Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear. The attention she had been so uncomfortable with me receiving was now focused on the family dysfunction she had helped create. Guests were clearly talking about the unusual arrangement, but not in the way that reflected poorly on me. Instead, they were praising Theodore's obvious devotion and quietly questioning Donald's absence from the father of the bride role. As we reached the back of the church, Theodore caught up with us, moving more quickly than I had seen him move in years. "Charlotte, my dear girl," he said, tears streaming down his face. "That was the most beautiful ceremony I've ever witnessed. I am so proud to be your grandfather and so honored that you chose me for this moment. Thank you for being the father I needed when I needed one," I said, hugging him tightly. Behind us, I could hear the murmur of guests discussing the ceremony, and I knew that the story of Theodore's walk down the aisle would be told and retold at family gatherings for years to come. Donald's absence from his traditional role would become family legend, a cautionary tale about the consequences of favoritism and neglect. My revenge was complete, and it was perfect. The reception at the Charlotte Country Club was everything I had dreamed it would be, made even more special by Theodore's presence at the head table. As the father figure who had walked me down the aisle, he sat in the place of honor, typically reserved for the father of the bride, while Donald sat at a regular guest table with Sarah and her family. During the cocktail hour, I watched as guest after guest approached Theodore to congratulate him and share stories about his role in my life. My college friends talked about how he had visited me at school and taken me out for dinner whenever I was homesick. My coworkers mentioned how he attended every one of my work presentations and company picnics. Family members shared memories of Theodore stepping in to fill the gaps that Donald had left. "Theodore, you did such a beautiful job walking Charlotte down the aisle," said Mrs. Henderson, our longtime neighbor. "You could see how much that moment meant to both of you." "It was the honor of my lifetime," Theodore replied, his voice still thick with emotion. Meanwhile, I noticed that Donald was having very different conversations. People were politely asking where he had been sitting during the ceremony, and his explanations were met with confused and sometimes disapproving expressions. The story was spreading through the reception, and not in a way that painted him in a favorable light. When it came time for the father of the bride's speech, I stood up and took the microphone. "I want to thank someone very special." I began, looking directly at Theodore. "Grandpa, you have been my rock, my guide, and my biggest supporter for the past 20 years. You taught me what unconditional love looks like, and you showed me every day that actions matter more than titles. Thank you for being the father I needed when I needed one most. This day wouldn't have been complete without you. By my side, the applause was thunderous, and I saw several guests wiping away tears. Theodore stood up and bowed slightly, his face radiant with pride and joy. As the evening progressed, the full weight of Donald's choice became increasingly apparent. During the traditional father-daughter dance, I danced with Theodore instead, and the DJ announced it as Charlotte dancing with her grandfather Theodore, who raised her and walked her down the aisle today. The symbolism was unmistakable. Every tradition that typically honored the father of the bride was instead honoring Theodore, while Donald sat at his table, looking increasingly isolated and regretful. Sarah had stopped trying to defend their decision and was now staring at her plate, clearly uncomfortable with the attention her manipulation had brought to the family dysfunction. After our dance, several other family members approached Theodore to shake his hand and express their admiration for his devotion to me. My great-aunt Helen, the family matriarch, made a point of telling him loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. Theodore, you've always been the real father in Charlotte's life. Everyone in this family knows that. You earned this honor. Donald overheard this comment, and I saw him flinch as if he'd been physically struck. The public recognition of Theodore's superior claim to the father role was exactly what I had hoped for, but seeing Donald's pain was more complicated than I had expected. I felt vindicated, but not cruel, satisfied, but not vengeful. As the reception wound down, Donald approached me hesitantly. Charlotte, I need to talk to you, he said quietly. What is it, Dad? I made a mistake, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. A terrible mistake. I should have been the one walking you down that aisle. And instead, I let Sarah's jealousy convince me to give up the most important moment I'll ever have with my daughter. I looked at him for a long moment, seeing genuine regret in his eyes for the first time. Yes, I said simply. You did. The months following my wedding brought consequences that reached far beyond that single day. Donald faced years of family ostracism when relatives learned he had refused to walk his daughter down the aisle due to his other daughters' jealousy, making him appear weak, and favoritism driven to extended family who had always respected my independence and achievements. Sarah lost her sister's love permanently when I realized that her selfishness had cost us both our father's presence at the most important day of my life, leading to complete estrangement between us that would last for years. Donald's relationship with both daughters deteriorated as I maintained limited contact, while Sarah grew resentful that her manipulation had backfired and created family drama she couldn't control, leaving him isolated from both children he had failed in different ways. Theodore became the acknowledged patriarch of my new family, present for every milestone and celebration, while Donald was excluded from future grandchildren's lives and major family events, having proven through his absence that titles don't make fathers, presence and love do. I smiled as I looked through my wedding photos months later, seeing Theodore's radiant face as he walked me down the aisle, surrounded by family and friends who celebrated our bond without reservation, understanding that Donald's rejection had revealed which relationships in my life were built on unconditional love rather than conditional approval. Sometimes losing a disappointing father helps you appreciate the people who truly deserve the title, and I learned that the most satisfying revenge isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's simply about choosing to honor the love that has always been there waiting to be recognized.